The frost came early to western Minnesota in the autumn of 1892, arriving not with the gradual cooling that eased a man into the season, but with a single overnight drop that left the ground stiff and the water in the trough skinned with ice by morning. Edvard Brandt noticed it when he stepped outside before dawn to check on his horse and found the animal's breath coming in long white plumes, the kind that meant the cold had settled in with intention rather than passing through. He stood in the gray pre-light for a moment looking at the sky, which was clear and hard and full of stars going pale at the edges. Then he went inside and added wood to the stove and told himself he had time before the real weather came. He was 41 years old and had been on his Minnesota claim for 6 years, long enough to know the difference between early cold and actual winter and to be mostly right about which was which. He had survived 5 full seasons on the plains. Not comfortably, never comfortably, but successfully, which was the standard the frontier actually applied. You measured survival in firewood lasting, in pipes not freezing, and everyone who had been breathing in October still breathing in March. By that measure, he had done well enough. By other measures, he preferred not to apply. The record was more complicated. He ate breakfast standing up the way he had eaten most meals since the previous winter, and went out to repair the fence line along his eastern field for the 3rd time since September. The walk took him past the Lindqvist property. He almost didn't stop. He had passed the claim a dozen times in the week since the new homesteader had filed her papers and begun building, and each time he had slowed enough to observe and then moved on with the private assessment of a man who has strong opinions about how things ought to be done and the social restraint to keep most of them to himself. What he had observed had not made the restraint easy. The woman had spent most of July and August doing something underground, digging a hole that, by his rough estimation from the road, was large enough to serve as a root cellar for a farm 3 times the size of her claim. He had said nothing about it directly, but he had said something to a neighbor at the feed store in August, something about a woman digging a hole that would make more sense on a burial ground than a homestead, and the neighbor had laughed, and Edvard had felt the small, mean satisfaction of having been amusing, which he now associated with a particular quality of shame. He stopped at the fence line beside her property and looked at the cabin. It was finished now, or nearly a solid single-room structure of notched logs, the chinking done with clay and dry grass in the way that worked better than lime mortar in freeze-thaw conditions, the roof boards tight and even. A competent build. He had not expected competence, which said something about him that he was not in a hurry to examine. But what stopped him was not the cabin. What stopped him was the absence of something the cabin should have had. He looked at the roof line for a full minute from one end to the other and back again. He walked along the fence to change his angle. He looked at all 4 walls from where he stood, tracing them with his eyes from foundation to eave. Nothing, no stovepipe, no chimney, no vent collar on the roof boards, no flashing around any penetration at all. The roof was clean and unbroken as a new plank floor, and from the direction of the cabin came the distinct smell of burning pine. He stood at the fence and breathed the cold air and thought about the smoke he was smelling. Then he let himself through the gate he had no invitation to use and walked around the cabin, once slowly looking at every surface at close range. The walls were solid. The roof was solid. There was no external stovepipe anywhere, no clay chimney rising from any corner, no indication that heat was being produced inside this structure, except for the smell, which was unmistakable and was definitely coming from within the walls. He completed the circuit and stood at the front door and could not make what he was seeing add up to anything that made sense. On the frontier, a cabin with no chimney and a fire burning inside it was not a curiosity. It was a problem. It was smoke in an enclosed space and carbon building in the air, and a person not knowing they were dying until they were already past the point of doing anything about it. He had seen what that looked like once on a claim near Redwood Falls in the winter of 1888, and he had not forgotten it. He knocked on the door with more force than he intended. When Maren Lindqvist opened it, the warmth that came out around her was not the sharp heat blast of a fire burning in a small room. It was something more diffuse, even more like the warmth of a room that had been warm for a long time, rather than a room that currently contained a fire. He noticed this in the half-second before he noticed her face, which was calm in a way that did not register his presence as an intrusion or a surprise. Her hands had clay on them, not fresh clay, but clay that had dried into the creases of her knuckles and under her fingernails. She was wearing an apron over a gray work dress, and she looked like someone who had been in the middle of something when he knocked and was prepared to return to it without excessive delay. He asked her directly about the chimney. She looked at him with the patience of a person who has already answered this question in their own mind and is waiting for the other party to catch up. Then she smiled, not the social smile of appeasement, but the private smile of someone holding a conclusion they know to be correct, and told him to come around back. He followed her along the south wall to the back of the property. She stopped and pointed. At the edge of the cleared ground, perhaps 40 feet from the cabin's back wall, there was a low arrangement of fieldstone barely a foot above grade, fitted together without mortar in a rough circle, perhaps 2 feet across. From the center of this arrangement, a thin wisp of smoke rose in the still morning air, not the robust column of an active fire, but the ghost of a fire, the exhaled remnant of combustion that had given up most of its heat to something before arriving here. Edvard bent and held his palm over the opening. The air coming up was only faintly warmer than the ambient temperature. Not the breath of a fire, the cold sigh of a fire's last memory. He straightened and looked at her. She opened a hatch in the cabin floor that he had not noticed on his first interior survey, set flush with the boards, and fitted so precisely that the seam was visible only as a slight discontinuity in the grain pattern. Below it, a wooden ladder descended into dim warmth. She went down and he followed because not following was no longer a position available to him. The underground chamber was roughly 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, lined floor to ceiling with fieldstone fitted by hand and mortared with clay. The air was warm and dense and carried the mineral smell of heated stone, a smell that had no analog in any structure he had entered above ground. At the center of the chamber stood a stone column that occupied a significant portion of the available space, not a modest chimney, but a massive one 18 inches of wall thickness, surrounding a flue that was nearly 2 feet across, rising from the chamber floor to the cabin floor above, and radiating heat in all directions, with the quiet patience of something that had been accumulating energy for hours and intended to keep releasing it regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. Edvard pressed his hand against the chimney stone and held it there. The heat that came through his palm was not the fluctuating heat of an active fire. It was steady and deep and came from the full thickness of the stone, from the interior of the mass itself, which had absorbed combustion energy over many hours and was now releasing it at the rate the physics of the material allowed, rather than the rate a man could shovel wood. He had felt stone warm from the sun before. This was different, denser, more sustained, more like the heat of a living thing than an inanimate one. Maren stood beside the chimney column and explained what she had built in the particular way of someone who has done a thing so many times in their mind that the explanation has been refined down to its essential structure with the unnecessary words already removed. The stove above connected to a pipe that angled downward at 15 degrees through the floor into the base of this chimney column. Hot gas from the fire, she said, was denser than the cooler air already in the lower portion of the flue, and the pressure differential created by that temperature gap produced the draft enough pull to move the combustion gases downward and into the chamber against their natural inclination to rise. The stone mass absorbed the heat from those gases as they moved through and around the column. The gases then cooled and traveled laterally through a clay pipe that ran 40 feet underground to the vent outside. By the time they reached the vent, they had surrendered most of their thermal energy to the stone and the surrounding earth and exited the system at near ambient temperature. The stone, having absorbed that energy, released it slowly into the chamber air. The chamber air rose through narrow gaps between the floorboards above and heated the cabin from the ground up evenly across the entire floor surface for 8 to 12 hours after the fire itself had gone out. He listened to all of this without interrupting and then stood in silence for a moment, looking at the chimney column and at the chamber walls and at the lamp she was holding and at the carefully fitted stones under his feet. He ran the logic of it through his mind, the way a man works a stuck mechanism applying pressure at each joint to find where it would give, and found that it did not give. It held at every point. "You thought of this yourself," he said, not a question. She set her free hand flat against the chimney stone. "I read about masonry stoves in a book that came through the Chicago Public Library in 1887. European design, centuries old. Farmers building in brick, running the flue through a long path to extract heat before it escaped the structure. The principle was correct, but the application assumed a barn or a manor house with resources I don't have. She paused, pressing slightly against the stone as though checking for something. I changed what needed changing for what I had and where I was. He thought about the summer, about passing her claim and seeing the hole and saying what he had said at the feed store. He thought about 6 men he could name who had spent that same summer doing things that were far less useful and far more conventionally approved. He climbed back up the ladder. She followed. Inside the cabin, standing on the warm floor with his boots on, he could feel the heat through the leather soles. He had never felt that before in any structure he had been in. He moved to the corner farthest from the stove, the northeast corner, where the cold would concentrate in any ordinary cabin, and crouched and pressed his palm to the floorboards. Warm. Not as warm as directly above the chamber, but noticeably, undeniably warm. The temperature did not fall off toward the walls the way it did in every other room he had ever stood in. It maintained itself. He stood up and looked at the stove. Small as he had noticed, smaller than what he ran in his own cabin, which was already smaller than what most of the homesteaders in the section used. And yet the room was warmer than any room he had been in all autumn, and the fire in the small stove was visibly modest, burning at a level he would have considered inadequate for heating a room half this size by conventional means. He had one thing left to say, and he said it with the directness that characterized him when he was not trying to be charming. Why go through all this trouble? She looked at him for a moment before answering, and in the looking, there was something being assessed, not hostility, but the particular evaluation of a person deciding how much of a true answer to give. Then she set her hand on the chimney stone, the physical gesture of someone touching something they built, and trust completely, and she said, "Because winter is coming, and I intend to survive it without fear." He nodded. He didn't tell her he didn't understand yet how powerful that sentence was. He didn't know yet himself. He left and walked the fence line, which he repaired with less than his full attention, because part of his mind was still in the underground chamber, pressing its palm against warm stone. Maren Lindqvist was 33 years old. She had been born in Illinois to parents who had come from Sweden before she was old enough to know it, which meant she was American in every way that mattered practically, and Swedish in the particular way of people who grew up with a second language at the dinner table, comfortable with the sounds of it, shaped by certain habits of thought that came from it, but not foreign in any sense that the frontier would recognize or care about. Her father had been a carpenter in Rockford, a good one, the kind of craftsman who understood materials at the level of intuition, rather than just technique, and who had passed that understanding to his daughter, because she was the one who followed him to the workshop and asked questions. She had spent 8 years in Chicago working in the construction trade, not as a carpenter herself, which the trade would not have accommodated without a fight. She decided wasn't the right fight, but as a drafting assistant and then a site coordinator for a building company that constructed commercial properties in the Loop District. She read every technical document that came through the office. She borrowed books from the Chicago Public Library on engineering, thermodynamics, structural masonry, and the history of building practices from colder climates. She took notes in a small ledger she kept in her coat pocket and reviewed them on the streetcar and at the counter of the boarding house where she ate breakfast and in the margins of other documents when she thought no one was looking. In 1891, the building company was sold to a larger concern that brought in its own staff, and Maren found herself with a small amount of savings, a ledger full of technical notes, in the specific kind of clarity that arrives when the structure you have been inside disappears and you are standing in the open air for the first time in years. She spent a winter in Chicago thinking about what she actually wanted rather than what was available to her. In the spring of 1892, she took the train to Minnesota and filed her homestead claim on 40 acres in the section west of Wilmar. She had promised herself one thing standing on the flat, empty land, looking at the sky that went all the way to the ground in every direction. The cabin she built would not lose heat, the way every frontier cabin she had ever been in lost heat. She was not willing to spend her winters feeding wood into a chimney that blasted the most valuable resource of the season directly into the sky above the roofline. She had seen what that cost, not just in wood, but in labor, in anxiety, in the slow wearing down of people who slept cold and woke cold and spent their days cold, except for the small radius around a stove that couldn't hold the warmth it made long enough for anyone to count on it. She dug the pit in June. The work was harder than she had calculated, which she had anticipated. The ground in western Minnesota is a particular kind of resistant, not bedrock, which would have stopped her entirely, but dense clay subsoil packed by centuries of freeze-thaw cycling into something that gave way only under sustained effort and rejected the shovel at irregular intervals by presenting its hardest face without warning. She dug 6 feet down and 8 feet by 10 feet across, hauling the clay up in a bucket on a rope rigged from a post. And the daily volume of spoil she removed accumulated in a low mound beside the hole that her neighbors interpreted when they passed on the road as either a very large root cellar or a project without a plan. The neighbors had opinions about both possibilities. She heard the opinions secondhand through the particular social mechanism of the frontier that transmitted judgment faster than news. A woman digging alone, a hole with no obvious purpose, the measurements wrong for anything sensible. She absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, noted it, considered whether it contained anything useful, and set it aside when it did not. The hole was the right size for what she was building. What the road thought about it was not relevant to whether it would work. She lined the walls with field stones she quarried from the creek bed, a quarter-mile east, carrying it by wheelbarrow in loads that took most of a day, each fitting each stone by hand, with clay mortar that she mixed in a trough she had built for the purpose. The stonework took most of July. The chimney column rose in August, course by course, each layer of stone fitted and checked and let cure before the next was added, the flue dimension carefully against the calculations she had worked out in her Chicago ledger and recalculated twice on site. The horizontal flue pipe was fired clay sections joined with mortar run in a shallow trench from the chamber to the vent location she had chosen for its distance and its natural concealment among the existing fieldstone at the property edge. She set the cabin floor above the chamber in September, leaving the specific gap dimensions between the boards that her calculations required. She installed the small stove and ran the connecting pipe at its deliberate downward angle to the chimney base below. She tested the system on a cool September evening with a small fire and spent an hour on the floor with her palms flat against the boards, measuring the heat distribution, checking her corners, feeling for the draft, working in the direction she had designed it to work. When the test confirmed the design, she allowed herself 1 cup of coffee, sitting on the warm floor with her back against the wall, and the ledger open to the page where she had first sketched the basic diagram in Chicago. She did not celebrate. There was too much left to do before November. Edvard came back a week after his first visit. He came with a question that had been developing since he left sharpening. Over the intervening days, as he worked his fence line and shoveled his barn, and lay awake longer than usual, looking at the ceiling of his cabin, which was cold enough that the logs had contracted slightly, and the wind found the gaps in the chinking and moved through them with the muted persistence of something that could not be stopped. Only managed. The question was technical about the draft mechanism, specifically about whether the downward flow worked consistently or whether there were conditions under which it reversed and sent smoke back into the cabin. He had thought about it enough to identify it as the weak point in his understanding of the system, the place where his mind kept returning when it tried to find the flaw. She answered the question on the doorstep without making him come inside to ask it, which he appreciated. The draft was consistent as long as the fire was burning at or above a minimum temperature threshold. She said below that threshold in a dying fire, the draw could weaken. This was why the stone mass was critical. It stored enough heat to maintain the system above that threshold long after the fire itself had dropped below it. She had run the numbers, and she had tested the outcome, and the outcome had matched the numbers. The draft did not reverse. He came back a third time 3 days before the first hard frost, and this time he did not pretend to have a specific question. He came because his cousin Jonas was arriving from Wisconsin for the winter, and he wanted Jonas to see the chamber, partly because Jonas was mechanically inclined and would understand what he was looking at, and partly because Edvard had been talking about it with an enthusiasm he recognized as unusual for himself and wanted the validation of someone else's reaction. Jonas went down the ladder and spent 20 minutes in the chamber, longer than Edvard had on his first visit. He came up with clay on his coat from where he had pressed too close to the wall and an expression of focused absorption. His first question was about the flue dimensions and their relationship to firebox volume, which was the kind of question Marin answered at length, and which led to a conversation between the two of them about the thermal properties of different stone compositions that Edvard followed for about half of it, before accepting that he was listening to people whose minds worked similarly in a register he could admire without fully sharing. He looked at the floor while they talked. He pressed his boot against it and felt the warmth through the leather. He thought about Clara. He had not been thinking about her, he had been watching Marin's expression as she talked the particular engagement of someone explaining a thing they loved to someone capable of understanding it. And then suddenly he was thinking about her the way it happened, without permission, arriving in the body before the mind had decided to allow it. Clara had died in February of the previous year. Pneumonia, the doctor in Wilmar said when Edvard drove the 12 miles to get him, which he did after waiting one day too long, because he had believed until that morning that she was improving. The doctor said the cold had settled in the chest, and the chest had not fought it off. He said it in the language of medicine, with the neutral delivery of a man who had said similar things many times, and Edvard had driven back to the claim in the dark, and sat in the cabin that was still cold, because the fire had been small while he was gone, and told himself what he would spend the next year telling himself, that he had done what he could. He had not done what he could. What he could have done was different from what he had done, and the distance between those two things had a specific shape and weight that he carried without the relief of being able to put it down. He had let the fire go low. He had trusted that the cabin held heat adequately. He had been wrong on both counts, and the wrongness had a consequence that could not be revised. Standing in Marin's cabin on the warm floor listening to Jonas and Marin discuss flu dimensions, he said out loud the thing he had not said to anyone. "My wife died last February. The fire went out." Both of them were quiet. Jonas looked at the floor. Marin looked at Edvard. He was not asking for something. He was not certain why he had said it. The words had formed and exited by a mechanism that bypassed the usual editorial process, and now they were in the room and he was accountable for them. Marin did not offer the sounds that people typically offered, the reflexive words of condolence that filled the space without occupying it. She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like actual thought rather than pause, and then she said, "She died because we didn't know enough. Now we know more. That's the only thing we can do for the ones we've already lost, learn more and make sure no one else is lost the same way." It was not comfort in the way comfort was usually offered. It did not soften the fact or redirect the feeling or suggest that something better waited on the other side of the grief. It was a factual statement about the only action available to a person standing where Edvard was standing, which was forward motion informed by what the loss had taught. He stood with it for a moment and found that it fit the shape of what he needed better than anything more gentle would have. He did not say anything else about it. Neither did she. They talked about the chamber for another hour, and by the time he and Jonas walked back across the cooling fields toward their own cabin, the sky to the northwest had taken on the low, featureless gray that Edvard knew well and did not welcome. He stopped and looked at it for a moment. Jonas came up beside him and looked too. The clouds were the particular flat gray that meant moisture and volume. Not the dramatic purple gray of a summer storm, but the heavy committed gray of a system that had traveled a long distance and intended to stay. The wind that came before it would arrive first, and then the snow, and then the cold that followed snow on the Minnesota plains, like a debt that came due after the creditor had already left the room. Edvard started walking again. Jonas matched his pace. Behind them, 40 acres back, Marin Lindqvist went down her hatch one more time before evening to press her hand against the chimney stone and confirm what she already knew, that it was warm, that it was ready, that the work of the summer had produced the result the calculations had promised. She stayed in the chamber for a few minutes in the dark, her palm flat against the stone, feeling the stored heat come through it with the steady patience of mass releasing energy at its own pace, indifferent to the weather gathering on the horizon and entirely prepared for it. She climbed back up, closed the hatch, set it flush with the floor. The sky to the northwest continued to darken through the supper hour and into the night, pressing down on the plains with the deliberate, unhurried weight of a season fully committed to itself. Edvard added wood to his stove and checked the pipe joint at the ceiling and laid down on his bunk without taking his socks off, which was a habit of autumn that he had developed not from cold but from caution, and listened to the first tentative wind testing the corners of his cabin for a weakness. On the warm floor of a cabin 40 acres away, a woman who had spent a summer building something everyone said was wrong sat with her ledger open to the first page of notes she had made in Chicago 5 years before reading it, not for information she had forgotten, but for the particular satisfaction of seeing a prediction confirmed by evidence. The numbers had been right. The stone had done what stone does when asked correctly. The heat was in the ground beneath her feet, patient as geology, ready as a well in drought season. She closed the ledger and set it on the shelf and listened to the wind pick up outside. She was not afraid of it. That was the difference. Not the stone, not the mathematics, not the summer of solitary labor, though all of those things were real and necessary. The difference was that she had built something that gave her a specific reason not to be afraid, something she understood from the foundation up, something she had tested and confirmed and trusted with the confidence that comes only from having made a thing with your own hands and watched it work. Fear on the frontier was not irrational. It was a reasonable response to conditions that killed people regularly and without apology. What Marin had done was not eliminate the conditions. She had changed her relationship to them. She went to bed. The wind continued its testing, working the north wall with the methodical persistence of something that had all night and did not tire. The first frost had already been and gone. What was coming was different, and it was coming now. The second storm arrived without the courtesy of a warning. November had barely settled over the Minnesota plains when the sky turned the color of a bruise, not the dramatic purple of summer thunderheads, but a low, featureless gray that pressed down on the land like a hand over a mouth. Edvard noticed it on his way back from checking the fence line along his eastern field, the same fence he had repaired 3 times since September. The air had a particular stillness to it that he had learned through painful experience to distrust completely. Stillness on the Minnesota plains was never peace, it was preparation. He picked up his pace without deciding to. By the time he reached his cabin, the first gusts had already begun. Not the tentative, probing winds of an ordinary cold front, but long, sustained pulls of air that carried ice crystals fine enough to get behind a man's eyelids. Jonas was already inside, sitting close to the stove, his bandaged hands wrapped around a tin cup. The blistering from the first storm 2 weeks earlier had healed well on the surface, but the deep tissue still ached when the temperature dropped and Jonas had stopped pretending otherwise. He looked up when Edvard came through the door, read his cousin's face without needing words, and set the cup down. Outside, the wind found a new register, something between a moan and a shriek, cycling in waves that shook the window frames in their settings. Edvard checked the stovepipe connection at the ceiling. Solid. He had repacked the joint with fresh clay after the last storm, working in the dark with numb fingers, while Jonas held the lantern. He added 2 more logs to the fire and adjusted the damper to keep the draw steady. Everything looked right. Everything felt wrong in the particular way that experience teaches a man to recognize not a visible flaw, but a certainty gathering at the back of the throat. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 40 minutes. He knew this not because he had a thermometer, but because the condensation on the inside of the window went from droplets to a spreading white film in the time it took to eat half a bowl of salt pork. Jonas pulled his coat tighter across his shoulders, not taking it off indoors, which he had not done since childhood. The stove glowed orange-red along its seams. Heat climbed from it in visible waves. And still the floor under Edvard's boots was cold enough to feel through 2 layers of wool sock. That was the thing about ordinary frontier cabins that nobody talked about. Plainly, the heat lived at the ceiling. A man could stand at the stove and feel his face burning while his feet went slowly numb. Children who slept on pallets near the floor understood this better than anyone. Warmth in a standard cabin was a vertical privilege. The closer you got to the ground, the closer you got to the cold that owned the earth below. Edvard thought about Marin's floor. He thought about it in the way a man thinks about water when he is thirsty, not as an abstraction, but as a physical fact with weight and texture. The warm boards under his feet when he had stood in her cabin. The way the heat came up through the grain of the wood steady and even without the fluctuation of a nearby stove. He had never felt anything like it before and had spent 2 weeks trying to talk himself out of being as impressed as he was. He had not succeeded. The wind outside shifted direction, suddenly slamming against the north wall with a concussive force that knocked a tin plate from its hook. Jonas was on his feet before it hit the floor, his bandaged hands raised slightly in a reflex that had no real purpose. They looked at each other. Neither spoke. The plate lay on the floor between them, rocking slightly on its curved edge until it stilled. The stovepipe groaned. It was a sound Edvard had never heard it make, not a creak from thermal expansion, not the settling tick of cooling metal, but a groan from pressure. The wind was pushing back down the pipe. He crossed the room in 3 steps and pressed his palm flat against the pipe's surface. It was hot, which was correct, but there was a faint vibration in it that did not belong, a pulse of resistance that meant the draw was fighting something from outside. He opened the stove door and looked at the fire. The flames were leaning backward toward him, away from the pipe, the opposite of what they should do. He closed the door and said the only thing that came to mind, "Get your coat." They were in the snow before they had a plan. The cold was absolute in the way that only the northern plains can manage, not merely an absence of warmth, but a presence in itself, something with mass and intention. The wind drove ice crystals at a horizontal angle, and within 30 seconds of stepping outside, Edvard could not see the fence line he had repaired that morning. He kept one hand on the cabin wall and moved along it until he reached the corner, then oriented himself by memory toward the direction of Marin's homestead. 40 acres between them, a distance he had walked 100 times in fair weather without thinking about it. Jonas came up beside him, his face already turned away from the wind, one arm raised against it. His coat was the heavier of the two, a long canvas duster his father had left him, and Edvard was glad for that much. He put his mouth close to his cousin's ear. "Stay close. Don't stop moving." They moved. The 40 acres became something else entirely, in a blizzard, not a distance, but a duration measured not in yards, but in the number of times a man convinces himself to take the next step rather than stand still. The wind came in pulses, and in the troughs between gusts, there was a strange, brief clarity where Edvard could see perhaps 10 feet in front of him, enough to spot a fence post or a rock outcropping and recalibrate his direction. Then the next gust would arrive and erase everything again, and he would move forward on faith in the memory of the land under better skies. Jonas stumbled twice. The second time he went down to one knee and did not come up immediately, and Edvard grabbed the back of his coat and pulled without ceremony, without asking whether he was all right, because there was no time for the question, and the answer did not change what needed to happen next. Jonas got his feet under him. They kept moving. The light from Marin's cabin window was not visible until they were almost on top of it, a faint amber smear in the white dark there, and gone with each gust like a candle seen through wax paper. Edvard aimed for it with everything he had left in his legs and arrived at her door, hitting it with his fist 3 times before he could make his fingers close properly around the latch. The door opened inward. The warmth that came out was not the sharp blast of a room with a roaring fire. It was something more complete than that, a deep, even heat that had nowhere to escape to, that had saturated the walls and the floor and the air itself until the cabin maintained it, the way a stone holds the sun hours after dark. It hit Edvard's face and he stopped moving, which was the first time he had stopped moving since leaving his own cabin. And in the stopping, he realized how completely his body had been consumed by the work of staying alive for the past however many minutes. Jonas came through the door behind him and simply sat down on the floor. Not on a chair, not on a stool, on the floor itself directly, because the floor was warm, and his legs had decided the question without consulting him. He put his bandaged hands flat against the boards and held them there, and the expression on his face was not gratitude or relief, but something more stripped down than either, the pure physical recognition of warmth after the absence of it. Marin closed the door and set the latch. She looked at Jonas first, assessing in the quick, practiced way of someone who has made decisions based on incomplete information before and was comfortable doing it. She crossed to the shelf beside the dry sink and came back with strips of dry flannel, old but clean, and knelt beside him without asking permission, and began rewrapping his hands over the existing bandages, adding a layer of insulation that his current wrapping lacked. She worked without speaking, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned from doing rather than instruction. Jonas watched her work with the mild, detached expression of a man whose body had temporarily been handed over to someone more qualified. Edvard stood in the middle of the cabin and dripped snowmelt onto the warm floor and tried to locate himself in the situation. His stovepipe had failed. The wind had reversed the draw, forced smoke back into the cabin, not just losing heat, but actively poisoning the air they breathed. If the pipe had fully blocked, if they had stayed another hour without noticing the carbon building in the room, the outcome would have been different, and he knew it. He had known it in the moment he saw the fire leaning. The wrong direction had felt it in his stomach before his mind had fully processed the information. The frontier did not send formal warnings. It simply changed the rules without announcement and waited to see who had prepared for the change. He looked at the floor under his feet, still warm, even in the corner nearest the door where cold air had entered every time someone moved in the past minutes the heat held. Outside, the storm made a sound like a freight train, finding its speed, a long building roar that peaked and sustained itself against the cabin walls without diminishing. The window over the dry sink flexed in its frame. Not much, but enough to see. Edvard watched it and said nothing. Maren finished with Jonas's hands and stood. She went to the stove, small as Edvard had noticed on his first visit, noticeably smaller than what most homesteaders used, and opened the iron door and looked at the fire inside with the particular attention of someone reading a language that most people couldn't see. She added one split of wood, not two, positioning it against the left side of the firebox with deliberate placement rather than simply dropping it in. She closed the door and adjusted the damper by perhaps a quarter turn. Then she straightened and walked to the floor hatch near the north wall. She opened it and descended without invitation or explanation. Edvard looked at Jonas. Jonas's expression communicated that he was warm and planned to remain where he was. Edvard went to the hatch and climbed down the wooden ladder into the underground chamber. The air in the chamber was denser down there, with a faint mineral quality that Edvard associated with the smell of a quarry in summer. The lantern Maren was holding threw amber light across the stone walls and the massive central column of the chimney, which radiated heat in a way that made the air above its surface waver slightly, the way air wavers above a road in August. He put his hand against the chimney stone. It was almost too warm to hold against, but he held it anyway, feeling the stored energy come through his palm with a steadiness that no wood fire could match. Not the sharp heat of flame, but the patient heat of massive weight, of something that had been slowly filling with warmth for hours and was now releasing it on its own schedule. Maren was moving along the south wall with the lantern checking each stone in sequence, pressing her fingers into the mortar joints, occasionally setting her palm flat against the surface for 2 or 3 seconds before moving on. She did this without rushing, without the performance of concern, simply gathering information. Edvard watched her and kept quiet because it was obvious he was in the presence of someone doing a thing they understood deeply, and interrupting that kind of focus carried a cost. She stopped at the northwest corner. She crouched and held the lantern lower. Edvard moved to where he could see what she was looking at and found a crack in one of the large foundation stones, not catastrophic, not even particularly dramatic to the eye, but running along a mortar joint in a direction that concerned her enough to keep her looking at it. The crack had been repaired before he could see that a line of newer clay over older clay, a slightly different color where the patching had been done. But the new patch had developed a hairline gap along its upper edge, and when Maren pressed the joint gently with her thumb, there was a subtle give that should not have been there. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a small folded cloth. Inside it was a mix of clay and fine sand damp already prepared, as though she had anticipated needing it or simply kept it on hand as a matter of practice. She worked the mixture into the gap with her thumb and the flat edge of a small stone tool, pressing and smoothing in short strokes, adding material from the cloth, checking the pressure with her fingertip. The work took several minutes of focused attention. When she was satisfied, she set her palm against the repaired area and held it there. Edvard finally spoke, not because the silence needed filling, but because the question had been assembling itself since he came down the ladder. How does the heat get to the floor above if it's all down here? Maren didn't look away from the stone. The chimney mass radiates. The heat moves through the air in the chamber and rises. I left narrow gaps between the floorboards, not wide enough to see through, but wide enough for air to circulate. The floor acts as a diffuser, spreads the heat across the whole room instead of concentrating it near one point. And the smoke? Now she turns slightly. The flue pulls down from the stove through the pipe. The draft comes from the temperature difference between the hot gas coming off the fire and the cooler air in the lower portion of the chimney column. The gas takes the path I've given it, which goes down first into the chamber, then across and up through the outer flue to the vent outside. She paused, pressing the repaired joint once more. The vent is 40 feet away, and the gas has lost most of its heat by the time it gets there. What comes out outside is barely warmer than the air around it. The crack, he said. How bad is it? Manageable now, left alone through another hard storm at this temperature, maybe 20% heat loss in this corner. Enough to matter. She stood and wiped her hands on her apron. It won't be left alone. They climbed back up. The cabin above had acquired two more occupants while they were below. The Garfield family. Thomas Garfield, his wife Ruth, and their three children, the youngest of whom was somewhere between 2 and 3 years old, had arrived in the interval, apparently having navigated through the same storm under worse circumstances, because Ruth Garfield's eyebrows were completely frosted, and the youngest child was crying with the particular high, thin cry of a cold infant rather than an upset one. Thomas Garfield stood near the door with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely certain about and was waiting to find out whether it was the right one. Marin took the infant from Ruth without ceremony and held the child against her own body inside her coat for a moment, then transferred the child to a folded wool blanket near the stove, not directly beside it, but close enough to feel the radiant warmth positioned on the floor, where the heat from below was already present. The crying subsided within minutes, not because anything dramatic had been done, but because the floor was warm and the child could feel it. Ruth Garfield sat down and put her face in her hands, not from grief, but from the release of tension that the body stores without permission during times of acute danger. Thomas moved toward the stove and then stopped, apparently realizing he didn't need to stand that close, and moved back toward the center of the room where the air was equally warm. He looked at his boots. He looked at the floor. He looked at Edvard with an expression that asked a question Edvard didn't have a complete answer to yet. The two older Garfield children, a girl of perhaps 8 and a boy of perhaps 11, sat on the warm floor without being asked, instinctively, the way children move toward comfort when adults are not directing them. Within 15 minutes, they were playing a quiet game with stones and a piece of string that the girl produced from somewhere, and the normalcy of it, in the middle of a blizzard that was currently trying to remove the roof from every other structure within 5 miles, was striking enough that Edvard found himself staring at them longer than was polite. Jonas had not moved from his original position on the floor, but his color had returned and his eyes were open and clear. He had pulled his knees up and was resting his forearms across them, his re-wrapped hands loose and relaxed, watching the room with the mild observational interest of a man who had nothing required of him for the first time in several hours. The storm outside peaked sometime in the middle of the night. Edvard could track its progress by the sound, not just the volume which fluctuated, but the pitch which changed as the wind found different angles against the cabin walls, and by the behavior of the lantern flame, which guttered and flared in response to pressure changes that came through the walls in spite of everything. The temperature outside, he estimated, had dropped below zero sometime after dark. He based this on the ice forming on the inside face of the north wall, just above the baseboard, and on the fact that the breath of everyone in the room was briefly visible when they moved near the walls, even though the center of the room remained warm enough that no one needed their coat. The floor, however, did not change. That was the fact Edvard turned over repeatedly through the long night, not as an intellectual exercise, but as something physical he could verify at any moment by pressing his hand against the boards. The floor stayed warm when the fire in the small stove had burned down to coals. It stayed warm when the wind peaked and the north wall breathed cold. It stayed warm when he woke from a shallow doze at what felt like 3 in the morning and found himself pressing his palm down before he was fully conscious. The way a man reaches for the thing he needs to confirm is still true. The floor was warm. The fire was out. Both things were simultaneously real, which meant the stone below was doing precisely what Marin had calculated it would do. He understood it differently lying there in the dark than he had understood it standing in the chamber. Down below, it was engineering, impressive, deliberate, the product of calculation. Up here in the dark, with people sleeping around him and the storm still working the walls, it was something else. It was the difference between reading about a thing and living inside it. Sometime after the 3 in the morning check, he went to sleep properly. He woke to the sound of Marin opening the floor hatch. The storm had not stopped. He could hear it still against the walls, but it had shifted from its middle-of-the-night ferocity to something slightly more sustainable, the way a fighter moves from explosive offense to grinding attrition. Gray light pressed through the windows, which meant morning, though the covered-over windows gave no sense of whether the sky was clear or still buried in cloud. He sat up. The Garfield children were asleep in a heap of blankets near the south wall. Ruth was asleep, sitting up, her head resting against Thomas's shoulder. Thomas was awake, looking at the ceiling. Jonas had moved in the night to a position nearer the stove, not because it was warmer there, but apparently out of some lingering instinct toward conventional heat sources. Marin came back up from the chamber with the lantern and set it on the shelf. She put a small amount of wood into the stove, 2 pieces. Both split thin and set a pot of water on top. Her movements were quiet and economical and gave no indication of what she had found below, which meant either it was fine or she was not ready to discuss it yet. From what he had learned about her in the past weeks, both were possible. He got up and went to the hatch and looked down. The lantern light was gone now, but the chamber held its own dim warmth, a faint orange glow from the chimney stone that was visible even without a light source. He pulled the hatch closed and stood on it for a moment, feeling the warmth come through the soles of his boots. Ruth Garfield woke and took in the situation. Children's safe warm room, storm still sounding outside with the rapid calibration of a mother, and then visibly relaxed her shoulders. She looked at the floor under her and then at Edvard with a question she didn't quite ask aloud. He said, "The heat comes from below." She built something in the ground under the cabin. Ruth looked at the floor again. Thomas, still looking at the ceiling, said, "I know. Heard about it in September. Thought it was—" He stopped. "Thought it was strange," Edvard said. "Yes. So did I." Thomas finally looked down from the ceiling and at Edvard directly. Something passed between them that did not require elaboration, the specific acknowledgement between two men who had been wrong about something in a way that had consequences and who were now in a position to know exactly how wrong. The water came to heat on the stove. Marin produced dried corn from a crock and began a simple porridge that would not be finished for some time, stirring it with slow, regular strokes. The Garfield children woke up one at a time, drawn by the smell or simply by some internal clock, and arranged themselves near the warmth without drama. The youngest sat in Ruth's lap and ate porridge from the spoon before Ruth could cool it properly and did not complain. By mid-morning, the storm had begun its slow withdrawal. The wind did not stop cleanly. It backed off in stages like an argument that ends through attrition rather than resolution. First, the worst of the gusts, which had been capable of genuine structural damage, became merely dangerous, then merely painful, then merely cold, which on the Minnesota plains in November was not nothing but was a manageable level of not nothing. The whiteout conditions cleared enough that Edvard could see through the fog of his breath against the window the outline of the fence line 40 yards distant. Jonas flexed his rewrapped hands experimentally and pronounced them better with the satisfaction of someone who had expected the answer but wanted confirmation. Thomas Garfield went to the door and opened it a crack and took a cold breath and looked out at the depth of the snow against the step and made a private calculation about what it would take to walk home. Marin came to stand beside Edvard at the window. The light outside was the flat white of an overcast winter afternoon, and it cast no shadows and gave everything an equal brightness that made distances hard to judge. She looked out at it for a moment. Then the Harwick place, his chimney is older than anything else in this section. Brick, not stone, mortared with whatever was cheapest in 1879. Edvard thought about that. He won't come here. He will if he has to. They were both right as it happened, in the way that people who know a community well can be right about it from different angles simultaneously. Harwick did not come that day, and he did not come that night, and Edvard learned later that the old man had spent those hours burning furniture, starting with a broken chair and progressing to a small table he had built himself 20 years before, because his brick chimney had cracked along a horizontal mortar joint from the cold contraction, and the smoke was coming sideways out of the crack into the room faster than the drafty cabin could clear it. He burned furniture and kept himself alive through an act of pure, stubborn will that suited his character completely, and when the storm was fully over and the path was passable, he showed up at Marin's door in the pale morning light of the second day. Edvard was still there. He watched Harwick come through the door. The frost on his beard, the particular stiffness of a man in his 60s who has spent 2 days in cold, that his body was no longer built to withstand the hands that trembled, not from weakness, but from the sustained effort of overriding the trembling for too long. Harwick crossed the threshold and stopped, and the warmth of the cabin reached him, and something in his face did a thing that Edvard had never seen the old man's face do before and would not have expected it capable of. Not tears, nothing so legible. Just a kind of settling, a release of a held thing, the physical expression of a burden set down after being carried past the point of reason. He lowered himself onto the floor and put both hands flat against the warm boards. He stayed like that for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, and to Marin specifically, "Never felt anything like it in my life." Marin set a cup of hot water on the floor beside him and did not make a production of it. Edvard moved to the window and looked out at the cleared sky. The temperature outside, he knew from the quality of the light on the snow, was somewhere south of zero. Not the brutal depths of a January cold snap, but cold enough that the retreating storm had left no ambiguity about what the rest of the winter intended. What he was standing in the warmth under his feet, the even air around him, the sleeping children on the floor, was not an accident or a lucky outcome. It was the result of someone thinking carefully about a problem that everyone else had accepted as permanent, and then building the solution by hand alone over a summer while her neighbors shook their heads from a safe distance. He thought about the crack in the northwest corner that Marin had packed with clay in the dark, while 12 people slept above her, which she had not mentioned to anyone, which she had simply handled because it needed handling. He turned from the window. Marin was stirring something on the stove. Harwick was still sitting on the floor with his hands pressed flat against it. The Garfield girl was braiding her brother's hair against his stated wishes. "Edvard, I want to learn how you built the chamber." Marin didn't look up from the pot. "I know. Not just the design, the actual work of it." Now she looked up. She read something in his face and gave it a moment, the way a person waits for a sentence to be fully finished before responding. "Then you'll need to dig before the ground freezes deeper, which means you have until January at the latest, possibly less. Then you'd better start explaining now." She set the stirring spoon on the edge of the pot and turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone who has been waiting for a question to be asked in its correct form and has finally heard it. She crossed to the shelf and took down a short piece of board and a piece of charcoal, and she began to draw. The lesson lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, with Harwick eventually pulling himself up from the floor to look over Edvard's shoulder at the diagrams accumulating on the board, and Thomas Garfield joining them, after a while, with the air of a man who has decided that something worth knowing is worth knowing properly. Marin drew the angles of the pipe. She drew the dimensions of the chamber and explained the relationship between stone mass and heat retention. The weight of the stone was the point, she said, not the composition of it. Weight stored energy the way a well stores water by volume. She drew the horizontal flue and its slope, the placement of the vent, the gap measurements between the floorboards. She answered every question without condescension and without simplification, answered them as though the people asking were capable of understanding the answers, if the answers were given correctly, which they were. Jonas, still on the floor, listened to all of it without asking anything, and later, when the others had stopped asking questions, said one thing: the floor gap measurement. If a man uses wider boards, does he need more gaps or fewer? Marin looked at him. Fewer. Wider boards, fewer gaps. The surface area per unit of heat transfer stays approximately constant. Jonas nodded, as though filing this away for a specific future use. When the last of the light went from the windows and the lanterns came out, the snow outside had stopped entirely, and the sky had the hard, polished clarity of a cold night, fully committed to itself, with stars visible through the window that had been hidden for 2 days by cloud. The temperature was dropping again. Edvard could feel it in the slight decrease of radiant warmth from the north wall, but the floor held. He thought this should be impossible. Then he corrected himself, because it wasn't impossible, it was just new, which was a different thing entirely. Impossible was what you called something before you understood the mechanism. New was what you called it after. Marin, as if she had heard the thought, or perhaps had seen the expression it produced: "It's only stone and heat. They do what they were made to do." Outside, the temperature continued to fall toward what January would eventually make routine. The Minnesota plains stretched away in every direction under a sky full of cold stars, white and silent, and indifferent to the particular arrangements of wood and stone and human will that were trying to survive below it. 3 families and 2 lone men had made it through a storm that would have gone differently in different cabins. None of them said this aloud. They didn't need to. The floor was warm under their feet, and the night was long, and there was more winter coming, a fact that Marin had known since October, had prepared for since spring, and had been quietly right about every single time it mattered. January arrived on the Minnesota plains the way a creditor arrives at a door without apology and with full expectation of payment. The cold that settled in during the first week of the new year was different in character from the November storms, different from the December cold snaps that had sent people to Marin's door in waves. Those had been violent and dramatic weather that announced itself with wind and spectacle and then moved on. January was quieter and more thorough. It did not roar. It simply occupied filling every gap and crevice and poorly mortared joint with the patient efficiency of something that understood it had all the time available and no reason to hurry. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero on the fourth day of the month and stayed there for 6 days without meaningful interruption. Edvard had never experienced a sustained cold event of that duration and magnitude in his 6 years on his claim, and he suspected from conversations with older settlers that most of them had not either. The kind of cold that cracked window glass along existing stress lines without any mechanical force. The kind that froze the water in a bucket left beside a stove overnight if the stove dropped below a certain output. The kind that transformed the landscape into something beyond merely hostile, into something that seemed to have reclassified human habitation as a temporary oversight it intended to correct. He was managing. He was managing because he had spent October and November and December learning things from Marin that he had applied in practical ways, reinforcing his stovepipe connections, adjusting his damper technique, storing his woodpile closer to the cabin to reduce the heat lost from his body on every trip to retrieve logs. He had not yet built the underground chamber. The ground had been too frozen since late November to make that possible, and Marin had told him plainly in October that he had until January at the latest, which had turned out to mean he had until the end of October because the frost that year went deep faster than either of them had anticipated. The chamber would have to wait for spring. He was managing without it, but managing was different from what he felt when he stood on Marin's floor, and the difference had a specific edge to it that the cold made sharper. He went to her cabin on the fifth morning of the deep freeze because Jonas had woken up with a rattling cough that reminded Edvard of sounds he did not want to be reminded of, and he needed someone to tell him whether the rattle was ordinary winter cold or something that required a different level of response. He brought Jonas with him because Jonas was capable of walking, and the alternative was leaving him in a cabin that was warm enough but not warm enough, warmed by technique rather than by the specific deep floor heat that Marin's system provided. She took one look at Jonas when they came through the door and pointed at the floor beside the stove without ceremony. Jonas sat. She put water on to heat and produced a cloth that smelled of something medicinal pine resin and something else Edvard could not identify, and told Jonas to breathe over the steam when it came. Not a request, an instruction delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had decided the relevant thing and saw no reason to soften its delivery. The rattle in Jonas's chest was ordinary winter cold, she said, after listening to his breathing for a few minutes, with her ear close but not touching his back. Inflammation, not infection. The distinction mattered because it determined what the body needed, which was warmth and steam and rest, rather than anything more drastic. Jonas would be fine. He needed to stay warm, and he needed to stop sleeping on the floor near the north wall of Edvard's cabin, which was where he had been sleeping, because it was closest to where he had been sitting when tiredness overtook him on multiple recent evenings. Edvard took this information and filed it alongside the other things he had learned since October that he wished he had known before October. 3 other people were already in the cabin when they arrived. Margaret Voss, who farmed the claim north of Harwick's property with her husband Albert, had come alone because Albert was managing their livestock through the freeze and could not leave the barn for more than an hour at a stretch. She sat near the south wall with a mending project in her lap, working by the light from the window, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who did not waste available light. She had been coming to Marin's cabin 2 or 3 mornings a week since December, not because she was in danger or desperate, but because the warmth of the floor made the morning hours productive in a way that her own cabin could not match. And she had the practical, unsentimental approach to resource utilization that the frontier either taught or eliminated. The other 2 were the Garfield children, specifically the older 2, the 11-year-old boy whose name was Will, and his 8-year-old sister whose name was Patience, which suited her less than it suited the concept. Their parents had sent them with a message from Marin about a technical question Thomas Garfield had been working on since November, when he had begun seriously planning his own underground chamber for construction in the spring. Marin read the note twice, set it on the shelf, and told the children she would come by the following week to look at the site he had in mind. Will and Patience were sitting on the floor in the northeast corner with a slate board between them doing arithmetic with the focused competitive intensity of siblings who have turned academic subjects into a combat sport. The warm floor was incidental to them at this point. They had been coming here long enough that it was simply the condition of the room, like light or gravity, not remarkable enough to notice. That was one of the things Marin had not anticipated, and which gave her a particular private satisfaction, that the children stopped noticing the warmth. Adults noticed it every time, compared it to other rooms, remarked on it, expressed amazement or gratitude, or both. The children simply accepted it as what a floor was supposed to feel like and got on with being children in a warm place. She found this more meaningful than the adults' wonder, though she would not have been able to explain precisely why. She poured 2 cups of hot water, one for Jonas, one for Edvard, and returned to the work she had been doing when they arrived, which was modifying the diagram she had drawn on the pine board in November. The original diagram had been functional, but imprecise in certain dimensions, and she was redrawing it with the measurements she had actually used, rather than the approximate measurements that were sufficient for explanation, but insufficient for replication. 3 people had asked for copies, and what they needed was not a teaching version, but an actual construction document, something a man could take to his property in March and build from without needing her present to answer the questions the drawing raised. The work of the winter, she was finding, was different from the work of the summer. The summer had been physical: the digging, the stone laying, the calculation to execution process of converting a design in a Chicago ledger into a structure in Minnesota ground. The winter was transmission. People came with questions, and the questions were not always the ones they thought they were asking. Thomas Garfield had asked about chimney column dimensions, when what he actually needed to understand was the relationship between stone mass and the volume of the connected space above it, because the dimension question was unanswerable without that relationship. Once he understood the relationship, the dimension question answered itself. This was the pattern of questions that were actually larger questions in disguise, and the work of answering them was the work of finding the larger question first. She had not expected to find this work satisfying in the way it was satisfying. She had built the system for herself. The sharing of it had arrived as a consequence of the system working, which she had anticipated. But the particular texture of the transmission, watching someone move from confusion to comprehension, seeing a face change when a principle clicked into place, this was something she had not calculated for and found she valued more than she had words to describe. On the 9th day of the deep freeze, Garrett Blaine came to her door. She knew who he was before he identified himself, because his reputation preceded him in the specific way that the reputations of men who hold economic leverage over their neighbors tend to precede them. Blaine owned the largest private timber claim in the county and controlled the distribution of cut firewood to most of the homesteaders within a 12-mile radius. He was not a cruel man in the overt sense. He did not price gouge during emergencies in ways that could be named and proven, but he operated at the boundary of what fairness required rather than well inside it. And people who had needed wood in a hard season and found his prices had moved. Since the last hard season, understood the distinction between a man who was not cruel and a man who was generous. He was 55, heavy-set, and dressed better than the weather required, which was a particular kind of signal. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the assessment of a man who was calculating something rather than simply observing, and what he said was not a greeting, but a positioning statement. He had heard that Marin had been advising her neighbors on heating modifications, and he had some concerns about whether the advice was sound and whether people acting on it understood the risks involved. Marin looked at him steadily. Margaret Voss put down her mending. Jonas from the floor watched with the mild, alert expression of someone who has recognized the shape of a conversation before it has taken its full form. She invited Blaine inside. She was courteous in the deliberate way of someone who will not give their opponent the easier argument of rudeness. His concerns as he laid them out over the next several minutes were structured around safety language. The underground chamber was an unproven design. There was a risk of fire spreading in ways that conventional chimneys did not allow. The closed system was untested across a full winter. In this climate, the people following her advice were potentially putting their families at risk, based on the word of someone with no formal engineering credentials. He said all of this with the smooth facility of someone who had composed it in advance, which Marin noted, and which told her something about the nature of the visit. She let him finish. Then she asked him one question, whether he would like to come down to the chamber. He would, he said, because he wanted to see the risk for himself. She opened the hatch and descended. He followed with slightly less ease than the ladder required, and when he reached the bottom and straightened and felt the warmth of the chamber and put his hand against the chimney stone, he was quiet for longer than the situation required. She watched him process the gap between what he had expected and what was in front of him. The chamber was not a hazard. It was not a rough frontier improvisation. It was precise, careful built by someone who understood the principles at work and had applied them correctly. He could see this. He was not a stupid man. She gave him time to see it. Then she said what she had been formulating since she recognized who was at the door. "I'll dismantle this system, mister. Blaine, the moment you make restitution to every family in this section who lost someone in the past 5 winters because they couldn't afford enough firewood to keep a safe temperature through a hard freeze." He looked at her. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who has nothing to lose in a confrontation because they are not the one with something to hide. The chamber hummed with warmth around them. 40 feet away through stone and frozen earth, the cold sat at 30 below and waited. He climbed back up the ladder without answering. He crossed the cabin floor without looking at Margaret or Jonas or the Garfield children. He went through the door and closed it behind him with the controlled force of a man who would have liked to slam it and chose not to. Marin came up from the chamber. She set the hatch flush with the floor. Margaret Voss had resumed her mending. Jonas appeared to have fallen asleep, which was either genuine tiredness or a diplomat's interpretation of the room. Blaine did not come back. He did not send anyone else. He did not file the formal complaint with the county sheriff that he had apparently been preparing, because the sheriff, a methodical man named Aldous Crane, who was no relation to Edvard and who had a reputation for fairness that the community had tested enough times to confirm, had been informed by at least 4 homesteaders before Blaine reached him that Marin Lindqvist's system had sheltered their families through the November storms and that any official inquiry into its safety would be received with a quality of community feeling that Aldous Crane correctly identified as not worth the cost of Blaine's convenience. The cold broke on the 11th day. Not dramatically, the temperature rose slowly over 48 hours from 30 below to 10 below to near zero to a relatively merciful 15 degrees, above which felt almost warm against what had preceded it. People came outside and stood in the new light, blinking their faces stripped of the held tension that 2 weeks of sustained cold had deposited and moved through the accumulated snow with the particular purposeful energy of people who have been confined and are now released and have a long list of things that need doing. Edvard came to Marin's cabin on the first morning of the thaw with a piece of paper on which he had drawn a plan. The plan was for his underground chamber. He had been developing it since October, refining it through the fall, and the freeze incorporating what he had learned from the November lessons on Marin's pine board and from his own observations of her system during the storms. The plan was not perfect. He knew it was not perfect because he could identify 3 places where he would need her input before he could proceed, but it was substantially correct, and it was his developed through his own thinking applied to principles she had explained. He laid it on her table. She studied it for several minutes, not speaking. He watched her look at it, the way she looked at her own work, not searching for problems to criticize, but tracing the logic following the design's reasoning to see where it went. She pointed to the horizontal flue section and asked a question about the soil depth in his location relative to the frost line. He answered. She pointed to the chimney column dimensions and asked about the stove size he intended to connect to it. He answered. She ran the proportions in her head and told him the column needed to be wider by 4 inches if he used the stove he had described. He corrected the plan on the paper with a stub of pencil. She handed it back. She said the thing he had wanted to hear, but had not known he was waiting for. "You can build this." He folded the paper carefully, which was not how he normally handled paper. He put it in his coat pocket. He stood for a moment looking at her warm floor with the expression of a man who has completed a mental journey and arrived somewhere he had not known he was going when he started. He said, "I want to put the first stone in while you're there." She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face that she filed without comment. Then, when the ground is soft enough to dig, April, most likely, possibly late March if this winter keeps moving. He nodded and said he would be ready and went home through the snow that was beginning almost imperceptibly to lose its grip on the land. February arrived. The weather in the first 2 weeks was cold but manageable, the kind of cold that the Minnesota plains treated as ordinary. and that the homesteaders who had survived the January freeze moved through with the particular competence of people who have recently discovered the outer limits of what the season can do and found that the current conditions fall short of those limits. There was a provisional confidence in the section, not comfort, never comfort, but the specific functional assurance of people who had made it through the worst and knew now what the worst looked like. Marin spent those 2 weeks completing the construction diagrams she had been refining since January. She finished 3 separate documents, one for the chamber excavation and stone laying, one for the chimney column construction, with dimensions scaled to 3 different stove sizes, one for the horizontal flue system with the vent placement calculations. She made 2 copies of each document. One set she kept. The other set she gave to Thomas Garfield on a Tuesday morning when he came by with a question about spring excavation timing, and Thomas held the papers with the careful handling of someone who understands they are holding something worth more than their physical weight, and said he would make additional copies for the other men who had been planning their own chambers. She said nothing about the months of calculation and revision behind those documents. She said the soil temperature note on the 3rd page is important. Don't start the excavation until the reading I've indicated, or the mortar won't cure correctly. Thomas said he understood and that he would make sure the others understood. He tucked the papers inside his coat and walked home through the cold with the careful, upright posture of someone transporting something fragile. The blizzard struck on the 19th of February without any of the preliminary signals Marin had learned to read in the northwestern sky. She woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of wind that was already at full force, which meant the system had moved faster than weather systems typically moved and had arrived complete rather than building over hours. She was out of bed and at the stove before she was fully awake, adding wood with the automatic precision of someone whose body had memorized the sequence, and then she did something she had never done in any previous storm. She moved through her preparation with a specific quality of urgency rather than her characteristic measured pace. This storm was different. She could hear it in the register of the wind against the north wall, not the cycling gusts of the November events, but a sustained, unrelenting pressure that did not drop between waves that seemed to have committed to a single note and intended to hold it. She pulled on her heaviest coat over her nightclothes and opened the hatch and went down into the chamber. She worked by feel in the dark, beginning at the northwest corner, where the repaired stone had been checked and rechecked through the winter and had held through every previous storm without further compromise. She ran her hands along the mortar joints in sequence, applying the systematic pressure check she had developed over months of maintenance reading the stone, the way a reader reads a page quickly, but without skipping alert for the word that doesn't belong. The chimney column was at full thermal mass from the previous day's heating, and the warmth coming off it in the dark was intense enough that she worked with her coat open, her hands moving efficiently across the surfaces. Everything held. She climbed back up and added 2 more pieces of wood to the stove, not the thin splits of normal operation, but 2 substantial pieces of dense oak that she had been reserving since November for a situation that required maximum heat input over a short period. She adjusted the damper to the position that produced the most complete combustion, which she had calibrated over months to a specific setting she could find by feel in the dark. Then she went to each window and checked the fit of the storm shutters she had installed in October, and found one on the east side that had worked itself slightly loose in the wind and pressed it back into its seating and secured the wooden pin that held it. She sat on the floor with her back against the south wall and waited. The storm built for 6 hours before it reached what she estimated was its peak, and the peak was something that translated into physical sensation through the cabin walls in a way that previous storms had not. The structure moved. Not dangerously, the log construction was solid and the foundation sound, but perceptibly a slight flex in the walls under the sustained lateral load of wind that had been building velocity across hundreds of miles of flat, open land before arriving at this particular obstacle. She felt it through her back against the wall. She set her palm flat on the floor beside her and felt the warmth there steady and independent of anything the storm was doing to the structure above it. The fire burned down to deep coals by mid-morning. She did not add more wood. The stone mass below had been charged to its maximum capacity over the previous 6 hours of intensive burning, and adding more fuel at this point would not increase the heat stored in the chamber. It would simply waste wood. She closed the damper to its minimum setting, which would allow the coals to sustain themselves for another hour before going out, and then let the system run on its stored energy alone. By noon, the fire was out. By noon, the floor was still warm. She moved through the cabin doing small tasks, the mending she had been accumulating, the review of her construction diagrams for any final corrections, the preparation of a simple meal from what she had stored. She worked systematically as she always worked, but underneath the ordinary surface of it was an awareness she had not felt in exactly this form before. This was the test she had been building toward since June. Not the November storms, which had been significant but short. Not the January freeze, which had been sustained, but static, the cold held at a consistent level against which the system had demonstrated its steady-state performance. This storm was dynamic and severe, and had arrived without warning and was testing whether the system could respond to maximum demand with minimum preparation time. At 2 in the afternoon, she went down to the chamber and checked the chimney stone temperature. The stone was still radiating at a level she assessed as more than adequate. The northwest corner repair was intact. The mortar joints were holding across every surface she could reach. She stayed in the chamber for 10 minutes, not because the inspection required it, but because the warmth down there had a quality in the middle of this storm, a deep physical certainty, the warmth of mass that had done exactly what she had calculated it would do, that she wanted to be present with for a moment before returning to the ordinary work above. She had built this. She had built it alone with her hands in the ground of her own claim from a principle she had read in a library book and a set of calculations she had worked out at a boarding house counter in Chicago. She had built it against the opinion of everyone around her, without assistance, without validation, without any confirmation that it would work except the logic of the design itself. And it worked. It had worked through the November blizzard that sent 12 people to her floor. It had worked through the worst January the region had seen in 2 decades. And it was working now in the middle of a February storm that was currently trying to reclaim the land from every human structure on it, radiating patient heat through the floor above into the room where she had been living and working and surviving since September, exactly as designed. She went back up and returned to her mending. The storm broke in the middle of the second night. The silence that followed was the particular silence of the Minnesota plains after a major storm, not empty but full of the sound of a world that had been rearranged and was settling into its new configuration. She lay in the dark and heard it and did not get up immediately. She pressed her hand flat against the floor beside where she slept and felt the warmth there, the warmth that had been there all night and that had been there when the wind was at its worst and the walls were flexing and the world outside was white chaos. It had not varied. It had not faltered. It had done the work she had built it to do. Edvard arrived before full light. He came through snow that had drifted to chest height in some places and knee height in others, navigating by the knowledge of land he had been crossing for 6 years. And when Marin opened the door, he looked the way people look after a sustained ordeal, that they came through intact, not celebratory, not relieved exactly, but settled with the particular gravity of someone who has tested themselves against something serious and found themselves adequate. His beard had ice in it. His coat was dark with snow that had not yet melted. He stepped inside and stood on the warm floor and said, "Marin, people are saying your cabin kept them alive this winter." She looked around the room, the floor, the hatch, the small stove with its cold iron, the window through which the pale first light of morning was arriving across 5 feet of new snow. She thought about what to say that would be true and not more than true. Then it wasn't the cabin, it was knowing we could build better if we dared to try. He stood with that for a moment. Then he told her about his night, about Jonas's cough improving through the storm's duration, because the cabin had maintained warmth adequately through Edvard's better technique, about his own fear in the peak hours of the storm, when the wind had reached a register he had never heard before, and he had lain awake with his hand against his own floor, which was not warm, but was not as cold as it had been last February. About what it meant to him to be able to say that. She listened to all of it without interrupting. He stayed for an hour and then went back out into the changed landscape to begin the work of assessing what the storm had done to his property. The days that followed the February storm had the quality of aftermath, the community moving through damage assessment, repair, the taking of inventory of what had been lost and what it held. The losses were real livestock in 2 cases, a barn roof in another, a well casing cracked by the freeze. But the human losses that a winter this severe would historically have taken the pneumonia deaths, the hypothermia cases, the fire accidents, from desperate improvisation in extreme cold, these were fewer than they should have been. The community had made it through, and the way it had made it through was not through luck or through the random distribution of hardier individuals. It was through the specific application of knowledge that had been available in Marin's cabin since October and in the copied construction diagrams that Thomas Garfield had distributed in February, and in the conversations that had happened around her warm floor all winter long. March came. The cold retreated by degrees, not graciously, but inevitably, the way things retreat when their season is over. The snow began its slow negotiation with the sun. The creek thawed from the edges inward. Mud appeared in the wagon ruts on the road, which was annoying and welcome simultaneously. Edvard began digging in late March. The ground was soft enough by the 22nd he checked it, the way Marin had told him to check it, with a steel rod driven to 18 inches, and the temperature of the extracted soil assessed by touch, and when it matched the benchmark she had given him, he put the first shovel in the ground. He worked an hour each morning before the day's other work required him, and an hour each evening if the light held. Jonas helped when his schedule permitted, which was more often than it had been in the fall, because Jonas had spent the winter thinking about the chamber and had developed a specific interest in the stone-laying phase that expressed itself as careful advanced preparation. He had been selecting and sorting fieldstone from the creek bed since the first thaw, organizing it by size and approximate composition into piles that Edvard had initially found excessive and now understood as exactly right. Marin came on the first Saturday of April. She walked the 40 acres between their properties in the early morning when the light was still low and the mud had the overnight crust that made walking easier, and she came carrying nothing except her coat and her ledger. She stood at the edge of the excavation Edvard had completed and looked at it for a long time without speaking, assessing depth dimensions, the quality of the wall surfaces, the drainage angle he had built into the floor of the pit. She climbed down and stood in it. She pressed the walls with her hands and checked the corners and looked up at the opening above. She took measurements by pacing and counting in the way she had used when she couldn't afford instruments, cross-referencing them against the calculations she had done for his specific stove size. She climbed back out. She looked at him with an expression that had in it something she rarely showed, not pride, which was too external, but something more interior than that, something about what the hole in the ground represented to her beyond its practical function. She said, "The depth is right. The drainage is right. You'll need to widen the south wall by 8 inches. You've lost some dimension there that the column needs. But the work is good, Edvard. It's careful work." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hole he had dug. He had his hands in his coat pockets. He said, "I keep thinking about how it looked when you dug yours, standing on the road looking at a hole and not understanding what it was." She looked at the excavation. Most things worth building look wrong before they're finished. He took a breath of the cold spring air and said the thing he had been composing for weeks. "I need to put the first stone in while you're watching. I need you to see that I understand what it is I'm building." She looked at him for a moment, reading the request, reading what it contained, what it was asking her to witness. Then she nodded once, which was sufficient. He went to Jonas's sorted piles and selected a foundation stone, large, flat-bottomed, dense, and carried it to the edge of the excavation and climbed down with it. She climbed down after him. He set the stone in the northwest corner, which was where she had told him the first stone went, and pressed it level with his hands, and when it sat correctly, he looked up at her, and something passed between them that did not require description, the acknowledgement of a thing understood not intellectually but physically, in the hands and the body, in the specific weight of a stone, set in the ground that would hold heat through winters not yet arrived. She climbed back up, and he followed. They stood at the edge of the hole in the April morning, with the sound of the creek carrying the last of the winter's belt toward the river, and the land around them beginning its slow conversion back to the version of itself that could sustain life without forcing it to fight for every degree. Edvard's chamber was finished by the middle of May. He fired the system for the first time on a cool May evening, a modest fire in the small stove he had installed at Marin's recommendation, smaller than he had previously used, which still felt wrong despite everything he now knew. He spent an hour on the floor afterward, moving systematically from corner to corner, pressing his palm to the boards. The floor was warm. Not as warm as Marin's floor, not yet. The stone mass had not gone through a full season of cycling and needed time to settle into its full thermal capacity, which she had told him to expect. But warm. Warm in every corner. Warm in the way that meant a fire had burned and the heat had gone into stone and the stone was releasing it upward through the floor, with the patient democracy that did not privilege the center of the room over the edges, that did not make a man stand near the stove to be comfortable in his own home. Jonas came in from outside and stopped just inside the door and looked down at his boots on the floor and then up at Edvard. He said, "It works." Edvard, "Yes." Jonas bent and pressed his palm flat against the boards and held it there, the gesture that was never just checking the temperature, but was also checking the fact of the thing, confirming that it existed, that it was real, that it was here in this place and of this making, and would be here tomorrow and through the winters ahead. Marin came by the following morning and he showed her the readings as best he could express them, the corner temperatures, the duration, the wood volume used against the heat maintained. She listened and made notes in her ledger with the focused absorption of a person collecting data that had value beyond this single case. She went down to the chamber and spent 15 minutes there while Edvard waited above. And when she came back up, she said, "The south wall stone you added in the second course, the one near the flue entry, there's a gap in the mortar joint behind it. You can't see it from the chamber floor, but I could feel the draft variance." She paused. "Fix it before October." He fixed it the following week. He would tell people later when they asked about the system and how he had learned it and what it took to build correctly, that the most important thing was not the design and not the stone and not even the hours of digging. The most important thing was the willingness to fix the gap in the south wall, to take seriously the small invisible thing that was not yet a problem, but would become one because someone with more knowledge than you had found it and told you plainly what it was. That willingness to hear the thing and address it before winter came was what separated a system that worked from a system that almost worked. Marin stayed on her homestead for 18 years. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was not the last hard winter in western Minnesota. The climate did not negotiate or make exceptions for human plans. Cold came in 1899 that matched January 1893 in duration and exceeded it in overnight lows. A blizzard in 1901 took 2 days off the calendar, the way the February storm had a racing time with wind and white. The land continued to operate on its own terms as it always had and as it would long after any of the people currently trying to live on it had concluded that project. Marin's cabin was the warmest structure in the section every winter she was there. People came from beyond the section, from Wilmar, from towns further out whose names had reached her through the particular long-distance word of mouth that operates in rural communities, the kind that travels by letter and by mention and by the accounts of travelers stopping overnight at way stations. They came to see the floor and the hatch and the low arrangement of fieldstone at the edge of the property from which nothing visible emerged. Some of them were skeptical until they stood on the floor. None of them were skeptical afterward. Several built their own chambers in the years that followed, and several of those chambers were built correctly enough to work well, and the ones that were not built correctly were brought back to Marin or to Edvard or eventually to Jonas, who had developed a specific technical expertise in flue proportioning that several communities in the region came to rely on. When the cabin finally came down, not from catastrophe, but from the accumulated weight of time and weather, and the ordinary entropy that claims everything, eventually the underground chamber remained. The stone held. People visited the site in the years after the structure above it was gone, and they would stand at the edge of the opening and look down at the carefully fitted fieldstone walls and the chimney columns still rising from the chamber floor and the mortar joints that had been packed and repacked through 18 winters of maintenance, and the corner repairs that were visible as slightly different colored clay against the original record of the care that had been applied to the structure over the years. Everything above ground had returned to ground. Everything below it was still exactly what it had been made to be. Edvard was old when the cabin came down. He had grandchildren by then. Jonas's oldest had 2 children of his own, and Edvard had become the kind of man who told stories to those children in the evenings by the fire, which was a fire in a small stove connected to an underground chamber that had now been operational for more than 2 decades and still heated the floor evenly from corner to corner every winter. He brought his grandson to the site one morning in late October, the same month the story had begun 30 years before, with the same kind of hard, clear sky overhead, and the first frost just passed. They stood together at the edge of the chamber opening and looked down at the stone. The boy asked what it was. Edward looked at the carefully fitted walls, the patient geometry of stone on stone, the work of hands that had understood what they were building and why. He thought about the road in the summer of 1892. He thought about what he had said at the feed store and the man he had been when he said it. He thought about a warm floor in a cold February and a ledger full of calculations carried in a coat pocket from Chicago to Minnesota. He said, "A woman built this. She built it alone in the summer while everyone around her said it was wrong. And when the worst winter in 20 years came, this is what kept people alive. Not luck, not strength, not anything you could see from the road. Just the work she did in the ground before the cold came when she still had time to do it right." The boy looked at the stone. Then why didn't someone else think of it? Edward looked at the chamber for a long time before he answered. And when he answered, he said the thing that was true and that he had spent 30 years arriving at. Someone did. She just didn't let anyone talk her out of it. The October sky spread itself over the Minnesota plains in every direction, pale and cold and permanent. The chamber below held its shape against the earth. Somewhere under the frost line, the stone that Marin Lindqvist had fitted by hand into the northwest corner in the summer of 1892. The first stone, the foundation stone, the one that everything else rested on, sat exactly where she had placed it in the position she had calculated, in the ground of a country that had once called her work a waste, and had since built dozens of chambers from the documents she had drawn on a pine board in a cold January and given away without keeping anything back. The frost had come again, as it always did. The stone did not notice. It had work to do.